Before you polish the old hunting knife in your grandfather's drawer, stop.
The finish you strip, the stamp you soften, the sheath you throw away, the faded name you can barely read. Those are the clues a collector uses to trace where it has been. And on one of the most commonly encountered Navy knives of the war, the clue is 2 letters. RH. Not combat, not commando. Remington Hunting. America sent a deer camp knife overseas. The steel outlived the men who carried it. The stories did not. At the end of this list is a knife man ordered by mail, addressed only Knife Man, Orlando, Florida. The rarest version was not made there. 12 knives, counted down from the ones most likely to be sitting in an American family's drawer tonight to the rarest and the most historically consequential. Start with the knife most likely to already be in your family. The Navy called it the Mark I, a blade a little over 5 inches, stacked leather washers for a grip, and nothing about it that reads as a weapon, because it was not drawn from one. The pattern was borrowed from the hunting and side knives already on American hardware store counters. The service bought more than 1 million in over 30 documented variations. Some collectors count past 40 from at least 9 cutlery firms.
Sailors who worked topside were issued a fixed blade because rope kills men.
The Mark I cut line opened crates and cans, scraped, pried, worked in weather. It went to sea as a tool and came home as one. Now the part that matters. One of the makers was the Pal Blade Company of Plattsburgh, New York, and Pal stamped the mark side of its blades. RH Pal 35. Turn the knife over. On a contract knife, the other face reads USN Mark I. On a knife a man bought for himself, with his own money, before he shipped out. There is nothing there at all. Same pattern, same factory. 2 completely different histories, and it is the blank space that tells you which one you are holding.
One note before the numbers start, and it applies to every figure in this video.
Most of these are dealer asking prices, and asking prices run higher than what buyers actually pay. Treat them as the ceiling of a conversation, not the price. A sound Mark I with its sheath is generally offered somewhere between $60 and $200. Those 2 letters came from somewhere. They came from a knife, twice the money and 6 inches long. Before the Marine Corps had the knife, everyone remembers, it had a shortage. In the first stretch of the Pacific War, there were not enough fighting knives to go around, and a great many Marines solved that themselves. They bought commercial hunting knives through the post-exchange system before they shipped out. The PAL RH-36 was one of the most available. 6-inch blade, stacked leather grip, red fiber spacers at the guard on early production, heavier in the hand than the Navy's Mark I.
That is the unheroic truth behind a great many wartime knives. A man walked up to a counter and paid for it.
One of those men was named WWII. His RH-36 survives with its leather sheath, and the sheath carries his initials and then his surname, pressed into the leather. That is all the knife itself can tell anyone. No unit, no ship, no date. A set of initials, a name, and the rest gone. Which is exactly what a name on a sheath is worth. Not proof of where a knife went. A thread somebody can still pull. Collectors watch 2 things. Bright blades and late-war Parkerized blades get listed interchangeably by sellers who do not know the difference, and the spacers, pommel, and sheath type all move the number. Asking prices run from around $85 to past $250 with the correct sheath.
PAL inherited its model numbers from a company that walked away from the knife business. The next firm inherited a myth instead.
Little Valley, New York. 6-inch blade, close to 1/5 of an inch thick at the spine, stacked leather washers, and a heavy layered steel pommel that looks like it was meant to hit something. Every seller repeats the same story. The Q stands for quartermaster, and the knife went to supply troops for opening crates and driving nails. Frank Trzaska, who has done more documentary work on American military knives than almost anyone, points at the problem with that. Photographs put the 225Q in nearly every theater of the war, worn by frontline men. The quartermaster story is oral history, repeated, plausible, and never documented. Look at the blade instead. The belly is deep enough to skin an animal. The fullers are so shallow they remove almost no weight at all. It is a sporting profile with a combat record. One of these hung for years on a peg above a workbench in a family garage. The sons took it camping. It split firewood, cut branches, and skinned the occasional squirrel. To a collector, it was a $60 knife. Then, in 2003, one of those sons asked his father, a veteran of the 10th Mountain Division, what he had carried on patrol. The father sent him down to the workbench to fetch it.
The knife did not change that day. What changed is that somebody finally wrote the answer down.
And this is where a family can undo decades of value in an afternoon. On this pattern, the money sits in original surface and an original sheath. Polishing removes both the finish and the argument. Replacement sheaths, including modern nylon, turn up constantly in auction lots. Asking prices sit around $55 to $150. One sold on eBay in September of 2024 for $90. Which raises an awkward question, because another company made a knife so close to this one that collectors still mix them up. Bradford, Pennsylvania. 6-inch blade with a slight drop point, 11 inches overall, a guard just over an inch and a half. Side by side with the Cattaraugus, most people cannot separate them. The Ricasso is the only honest answer in the room. Case, XX, 337, 6-inch, Q. That makes this the identification lesson of the whole list.
On knives this similar, the mark is not a detail. The mark is the entire provenance.
When a listing photographs a blade at an angle that keeps the Ricasso out of focus, you are no longer buying a knife. You are buying a claim. What it actually did overseas was unglamorous and constant. Ration cases, cord, tent line, food. 100 small jobs a day where nobody was handing out a second tool. Asking prices run about $90 to $250. You will also see these open at auction as low as $30. An opening bid is a tactic to draw bidders. It is not a value, and it should never be quoted as one. Two firms, two nearly identical knives. The next one carries the most famous name in American cutlery, and almost nobody remembers this particular pattern under it. Say Kabar, and everyone pictures the same object. The Marine fighting knife of 1943, 7 inches, stacked leather, the one still in production today.
So let us be precise. Kabar itself is not forgotten.
This pattern is Union Cutlery of Olean, New York. Also appears under a heading in the military knife record with a very plain name, 6-inch hunting knives. Case is on that list. So are Robeson, Queen, Pal, Kinfolks, and others. Not fighting knives, hunting knives. That is the government's own filing category, not a description somebody invented later. Here is the trap, and it is the one most likely to be sitting in a drawer right now. Between 1945 and 1952, the Wesky Cutlery Company of Sandusky, Ohio, bought leftover and overrun parts from the wartime contractors and assembled them for the commercial market, polishing out the maker's marks and the military markings, and fitting plain, ungrooved leather handles. So an unmarked knife that looks wartime and is genuinely built from wartime parts may still be a post-war product.
It is not a fake. It is not a war knife either, and the difference shows up in the price.
Asking prices for a documented 6-inch example run roughly $150 to $400, and the data behind that is thin. Kabar's hunting knives went to war under a contract. The next company never had one. Gladstone, Michigan. A timber cruiser named Webster Marble started making outdoor gear in the 1890s, and the ideal became the hunting knife the Upper Peninsula was built around. Marbles produced no military models during the Second World War. Bernard Levine's guide reports that military buyers simply took most of the company's commercial inventory and output from 1941 through 1945.
Read that again. There was no contract. There was a counter. It had happened before.
In 1916, the British government bought Marble's hunting knives for army issue. So a knife designed for a man tracking deer through Michigan snow went to the Pacific because a soldier walked into a store, or his family mailed it to him. No requisition, no model number change, just a hunting knife that got on a ship. The mark reads Marbles, Gladstone, Mich. Pre-war 6-inch examples are offered around $180 to $400, and the original tube sheath carries a large share of that. Marble's other famous pattern went overseas too, and as a design, it was older than most of the men carrying it. The Woodcraft pattern was patented in 1916, which means a man carrying one across a beach in 1943 was carrying a 27-year-old idea. It was built for camp work rather than fighting. A deep belly for skinning and food, a grip shaped for long jobs and cold hands. Nothing about it was meant for a war, which is precisely why it turns up in veterans' effects. Two things date a Woodcraft, and both of them matter to price. The pommel material. Stag, aluminum, or bakelite. Moves with the era. And the original leather tube sheath is worth a great deal of the knife.
A Woodcraft that has been separated from its sheath has lost more than an accessory. It has lost part of the record.
Asking prices run about $120 to $300. Every knife so far has had a maker's name you could look up. The next ones have none. Behind the front lines, in machine shops, on ships, and in depots, men made knives. Collectors call them theater knives. No model number, no factory record. Often no maker's name at all, because the man carrying it may also have built it. One is described this way in a dealer's catalog. The pommel cap marked with an electric pencil, Ed Richard. The front of the guard, 1944. The back of the guard, New Guinea. The blade, close to 8 inches, appears to have been reworked from a bayonet. The fuller runs unstopped straight into the ricasso, which is the tell that the steel began life as another weapon. That is one knife, described in one source.
It is not a portrait of every theater knife. It is an example of the only thing that can pull an unmarked blade back out of anonymity.
A name, a year, a place, scratched in by the man who owned it. Because the market has no other way to date these, and the theater knife market is full of fakes. Now back to those 2 letters. Remington Arms of Bridgeport, Connecticut sold hunting knives. A full catalog line, numbered RH with a model number behind it. RH28, RH31, RH32. Ordinary sporting knives, sold to ordinary customers in peacetime. Around 1940 or 1941, Remington sold its cutlery division to PAL, including the finished knives and the loose parts still in the racks. PAL did not rename the line. It kept the numbers.
And when the war came, those numbers walked straight into government paperwork exactly as printed in a hunting catalog.
One caution, because collectors have argued about it for decades. There have been attempts to decode the digits as blade type and blade length, and the scheme falls apart fast. An RH28 has 4.5 inches stamped right on the blade. What is certain is the part that matters. RH means Remington Hunting. Pre-war examples carry Remington's own stamp rather than PAL's, and they are offered around $100 to $300. This is the thinnest market data on the list, because too few of these reach the market described correctly. Remington's name survived on other companies' blades. The next firm barely left a record of its own. Little Valley, New York. The same small town that produced the Cattaraugus. 6-inch single-edged clip point, 10.5 inches overall, and on the better examples, a stacked leather grip rather than wood. Here's the strange part. Several patterns of these knives have still not been identified. The blades carry a single word on the ricasso, Kinfolks. No model, no date. A company that helped arm a world war and did not leave behind a reliable record of what its own knives were called. The sheath is the thing to check. Original Kinfolks scabbards are marked on the face, And a correct pairing is a real part of the value on a knife with this little paperwork behind it. Asking prices run about $120 to $300.
Kinfolks left almost no record. The next company left the best-made knives of the group comms, and the fewest of them.
Perry, New York. Shuredge was Robeson's blade mark, and it sits on the military's list of 6-inch hunting knife makers. Of the firms that delivered fighting utility knives under wartime contract, Robeson delivered the fewest of all. And collectors generally rate Robeson's work the best made of the group. Scarcity and quality inside the same object is how a forgotten name becomes an expensive one. And this is the detail that costs people money. Robeson and Pal both produced knives with wooden pommels because aluminum was scarce. To a modern eye, a wooden pommel looks wrong, like a repair or a cheap reproduction. It is neither. It is a wartime shortage frozen into an object, and it is a dating clue rather than a defect. Knives have been passed over and undersold for exactly that reason. Asking prices run about $150 to $400, and confidence in that range is low. Too few come to market to say more. Robeson said very little about its knives. The next company said far too much. In print, in its own advertising. Boulder, Colorado. The firm began as Platts & Sons in Gowanda, New York in 1896, founded by a cutler trained in Sheffield, England. His son moved the business west in 1911 to chase the American outdoors trade. The Shark was their wartime knife. The G46, made in 4, 6, and 8-inch blades, blued the way a hunting rifle is blued, with black and red spacers at the grip. Western never held a major government contract. It sold thousands of knives anyway, through unit orders and private purchase, and in a wartime catalog folder, the company announced that its entire factory output was earmarked for the armed forces. Then there is the advertisement. In a single sentence, Western listed what the Shark knife was good for: cutting a man loose from wreckage, slicing bread, opening cans, trimming toenails, and killing the enemy. The original wording is of its time and contains a racial slur, and it will not be repeated here.
But look at the list itself. 4 chores and a killing, in one breath, from the company that built the thing.
No historian ever had to argue that American hunting knives were being sold into a war. The manufacturer said so out loud, in its own ad copy, and then went back to selling them. Collectors should note that the 3 blade lengths get listed interchangeably and priced as though they were the same knife. Asking prices run roughly $250 to $600. Western's knife was a sporting company's answer to a war. The last one on this list was one man's. In 1938, a man named Bo Randall opened a shop in Orlando, Florida, making sporting knives. For hunters and for fishermen. That was the business. Then a soldier bound for the war came to see him. What Randall built afterward was not a hunting knife, and it should not be called one.
It was a purpose-built field and fighting knife. What matters is where he filed it.
He put it in his catalog as number 1, the first entry in a sporting knife maker's list, written by a man who until that year had made blades for deer season. Word traveled the way word travels in an army. Men who had seen a Randall in use wrote back to Orlando from wherever they were, and some of them addressed the envelope with nothing more than Knife Man. Orlando, Florida. General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne and Major Richard Bong, the country's leading fighter ace in the Pacific, are among the men named as carrying Randalls, and the shop could not keep up. In the middle of 1943, a businessman named W.F. Larson of Springfield, Massachusetts, came to Orlando with a proposal. Let a factory build the knife under license. 50 cents a knife, back to Randall. First, Larson had to obtain war production, board approval, and a materials priority. He reopened part of the Northampton Cutlery Company, running since 1871, hired skilled hands, and adjusted the design to suit its tooling. The first royalty check, covering 263 knives, reached Bo Randall at the end of October 1943. Those blades are stamped Randall made, SPFLD, Mass. Collectors call them Springfield Randalls, and to a certain kind of collector they sit at the top of the whole field. How many exist is genuinely unsettled. One published figure is about 1,058. An auction house catalog puts it near 1,200 and says, in its own words, that this is what is thought. The first royalty payment covered 263.
The exact number is not known, and anyone who states it flatly is guessing.
Which brings us to the most expensive mistake on this list, the sheath. Randall sourced scabbards from H. Heiser of Denver, from Clarence Moore, and from Southern Saddlery of Chattanooga. He preferred Heiser's quality and used them whenever he could. Collectors still argue about which supplier went with which run, and a mismatched sheath on a 4-figure knife is a very costly afternoon. Archive sold examples from 2011 ran between about $1,265 and $1,382. Dealers today ask roughly $1,400 to $3,500. Those older sales are not this year's market. They are a floor from a different decade, and the honest confidence here is low to medium. But the number that actually tells the story is not in dollars. It is a catalog entry. Number 1. One knife deliberately left off this list is the V42. It was designed expressly for war.
These 12 are more revealing precisely because most of them were not. So go back to the drawer.
A Cattaraugus hung above a workbench for decades and meant nothing to anybody, until a son asked his father a question and wrote down the answer. A sheath still carries a surname pressed into leather and nothing else. A pommel cap somewhere reads Ed Richard, 1944, New Guinea. Letters once reached Orlando addressed to a man the senders knew only as the Knife Man. The steel will last another 100 years without any help from us. Dry leather, a faded name, a soft stamp, and a story that only one person in the family still knows. Those can all be lost in a single afternoon. I have held an old sheath knife whose last surviving witness was a name pressed into a strip of leather, and understood that the object was never really the point. The man who trusted it was. So do not try to make the knife look new. Preserve what allows the next person to know who carried it. Photograph both sides of the blade and both sides of the sheath. Write down what your family says while somebody still remembers saying it. Do not polish it. Do not sharpen it. Do not replace the sheath. Keep any paper that came with it in the same box. If your family has one, tell us the stamp on the blade and what you were told about the person who carried it.
This channel is for people who would rather have the true version than the good story. If that is you, you already belong here.